I have watched James Ashford, Duke of Hartwell, walk into a burning building without flinching. I have seen him stand across from 2 pistols at dawn and not blink. I have watched him lose his younger brother to fever, his father to grief, and his first fortune to a winter that killed half his flock, and I have never seen him break. Not once. Not until Cecily Vane set her pen to a sheet of foolscap in the study at Hartwell Hall and informed him, with the composure of a woman twice her age, that she would require the use of the library on Tuesday mornings. That was the beginning. I was there, and I am still not entirely sure which one of them knew what they were doing. I should explain how it came about, because the world saw only the bare bones of it, the sort of story that circulates at card tables as a novelty, a cold duke and a ruined family, a marriage arranged between solicitors. They missed the thing inside the arrangement that made it remarkable. They always do. Sir Philip Vane had been a man of middling sense and excellent taste, which is a dangerous combination in a man who also holds a note of credit. By the time his affairs were fully untangled, which occurred approximately 3 weeks after his death, in the offices of a solicitor named Holt who wore the expression of a man navigating a swamp, it emerged that Sir Philip had owed money to a considerable number of people, and that the estate of Dunmore, which had been in the Vane family since the time of the 3rd George, was no longer in any practical sense the Vane family's property. James held the largest of the notes. He had not sought it. He had acquired it when he purchased a portion of a larger debt from a man who needed ready coin. It was not personal. James did not conduct personal business. He conducted transactions. It was Holt who suggested the alternative. James told me about it the following evening over a glass of port in his study. He recounted it with the same tone he would use to describe the rotation of crops. Miss Cecily Vane, the elder daughter, was of age and unmarried. The estate debt could be settled entirely, cleanly, by a marriage settlement. She would come to Hartwell with her personal effects and her younger sister's school fees paid through the following 2 years. He would wipe the debt. It was arithmetically tidy. "And what does Miss Vane think of this?" I asked him. James looked faintly puzzled, as though the question had not previously occurred to him. "Holt is to call on her tomorrow." I set down my glass. "James, she is a person, not a parcel." He looked at me for a moment. "The arrangement serves her family's interests," he said. "She will have a title, a house, and an income. Her sister will be educated. I require a mistress for Hartwell and an heir. The terms are reasonable." He was not being cruel. That was the thing about James that people mistook. They saw the cold surface and called it cruelty. It was not. It was the absence of something, some warm instrument the rest of us are born with, and he had either never possessed or had long since packed away in a box he could not find. He was the most competent man I had ever known, and occasionally, because of that, the most maddening. "At least meet her before you send Holt," I said. He agreed, with the manner of a man agreeing to inspect a piece of property before signing the deed. She arrived at Caldwell Square 2 days later in the company of a solicitor of her own, a small, precise man named Good, who looked as though he had been expecting to be underestimated and had made his peace with it. Cecily Vane herself was not what James had told me to expect, which was nothing, because James had told me nothing. She was perhaps 24, dark-haired, with the kind of face that becomes interesting before it becomes pretty, fine-boned, with large gray eyes that moved around a room the way a person moves around a room when they are reading it, cataloging its contents, deciding what is worth keeping. She sat across from James at his desk. Good sat beside her. Holt sat beside James. I had been told I was not needed and had come anyway, and was standing near the window in a posture I hoped conveyed neutrality. James opened the discussion by summarizing the debt, the estate's position, and the proposed terms. He was thorough. He was also, I noted with faint despair, reading from a document. When he finished, Cecily Vane did not speak immediately. She looked at the paper Holt had slid across the desk, and she read it. All of it. James watched her read it with the expression of a man watching a legal instrument being reviewed, which, to be fair, is exactly what it was. Then she looked up. "I have 3 additions," she said. James blinked. It was nearly imperceptible, but I had known him for 20 years. "I beg your pardon." 3 amendments to the proposed terms. She did not open a document. The additions were evidently in her head. "First, my sister's school fees are to be paid through her majority, not merely the next 2 years. She is 14, and 2 years is insufficient." She waited. Agreed, James said after a pause. Second, I am to have the use of the Hartwell library without restriction. I understand it is considerable. I will not have it locked against me. She said this without particular heat, as though she were recounting a preference for a certain type of weather. Another pause. Agreed. Third, she folded her hands on the desk, and her voice did not change, but her eyes moved to his, and I had the impression of two people measuring each other for the first time properly. I will not be managed. I understand that this is a practical arrangement on both sides, Your Grace, and I will uphold my part of it with complete loyalty, but I will not be placed on a shelf. I will run Hartwell's household as its mistress. I will appear as required in company. I will conduct myself exactly as a duchess ought, but I will not be made to feel invisible in my own home. She let the sentence settle. Those are my terms. The room was very quiet. James looked at her for a long moment. I do not know what he saw. He said, I do not intend to make you invisible, Miss Vane. No, she said pleasantly. I don't imagine you intend it. I merely wish to establish that I will not permit it, regardless of intention. Good suppressed something that might, in a different room, have been a smile. James held her gaze for another breath. Then he said, Your terms are accepted. She nodded, picked up the pen Holt offered, and signed. Her hands were perfectly steady. I did not tell James, then or for some time afterward, that I thought he had met his equal at that desk. He would not have known what to do with the information. He had a great deal to learn about Cecily Vane, and I suspected, I hoped, that the learning would be the most useful thing that had ever happened to him. They were married at the parish church at Stanwick, the village nearest Hartwell Hall, 6 weeks later. It was a quiet affair. Cecily wore ivory, and she wore it without apology, without the trembling of a woman who has bargained herself into a cage. She walked the aisle with the composure of a woman who has made a decision and is following through on it. James met her at the altar with the expression he wore to the exchange, which is to say, no particular expression at all. But his hands, when he took hers, were not quite as steady as hers had been in that study. I noticed, I did not remark on it. I am occasionally capable of restraint. Hartwell Hall was 3 hours north of Stanwick, and it was everything the name implied, a great gray pile of stone set against a hill, with a lake that reflected the sky like pewter in winter and the windows of the north wing that let in a wind like a polite intruder. It was not unfriendly. It had been the seat of the Ashford Dukes for 2 centuries, and it had the settled, unconcerned dignity of a house that has seen a great deal and is not troubled by any of it. Cecily saw it for the first time as the carriage came through the gate, and she sat forward slightly and looked at it, not with anxiety, with interest. It has good bones, she said. It is 300 years old, James said. So has most of what is worth keeping, she said, and sat back. James looked at her once and then looked away. He had given her the mistress's quarters, the rooms that had been his mother's, a set of connected chambers on the east side of the house, with windows onto the garden, walls paneled in pale green silk, and a fireplace that drew properly. He had had them aired and the linen changed, and a vase of late hothouse flowers set on the writing table. I know this because I heard about it from Mrs. Alderton, the housekeeper, who reported it with the slightly dazed expression of a woman who had not expected to be asked to prepare a room with particular care. Cecily thanked James for the flowers. He said they had been Mrs. Alderton's doing. Then please thank Mrs. Alderton, Cecily said, and tell me whether she prefers to receive direction from me in person or in writing. James looked at her again with that measuring quality, as though recalculating something. In person, he said, she is particular about that. Then I will see her in the morning. She was at breakfast by 7. She had seen Mrs. Alderton by past. By the time James came down at 8, his household had been quietly surveyed. 3 particular inefficiencies had been noted and were in the process of being corrected, and the cook had been told, very pleasantly, that the north wing servants' stair needed a new rail, and that she, Cecily, intended to raise the matter with the steward that afternoon, and would the cook let her know if there was anything else that required attention before winter came in earnest. James stood in the doorway of the breakfast room and watched her add a column of figures in the margin of the household account, and found himself at a slight loss. He told me this later rather carefully, as though he were not entirely comfortable with the admission. She reorganized the coal allocation, he said. Did she? It was she was right, he said. The north wing has been running cold for 3 winters. I didn't know. My steward Brent should have flagged it. She found it in the first week. She found it in the accounts. And asked the maids. He was quiet for a moment. She is thorough. James, I said, I think you are trying to tell me something else. He said nothing, which from James was considerable eloquence. Cecily Vane ran Hartwell Hall the way a gifted musician plays, not by forcing the instrument, but by listening to it, learning where it was out of tune, and adjusting with such natural precision that the music simply improved without anyone being quite sure how. She did not make herself visible in the way of women who demand acknowledgement. She was simply there everywhere in the right moment, doing the right thing, and the house responded to her the way cold rooms respond to a fire that is built properly. She kept Tuesday mornings in the library. She had arranged with Mrs. Alderton that she was not to be interrupted except in the case of fire or a genuine medical emergency, and Mrs. Alderton, who had spent 30 years watching the Ashfords conduct their affairs in silent, expensive isolation, had received this instruction with a warmth she did not attempt to conceal. James passed the library on a Tuesday in early November. He paused at the door, not quite stopping, and through the gap he could see her at the long table, 3 books open and one of them annotated, her pen moving. She was not reading prettily. She was thinking, working, the way a person works when they have forgotten they might be observed. He went on down the corridor, but he went more slowly. He came to me that evening. We were in the smoking room, a small, comfortable room at the back of the house with 2 chairs that had been in that position since his father's time, and he sat in his chair and said without preamble, "What does she read?" "I have no idea," I said. "Have you asked her?" He had not asked her. I looked at him with considerable patience. "Ask her," I said. He did at dinner the following evening. It was one of those dinners they had together in the small dining room off the main hall. Hartwell was too large for 2 people, and they had settled into a habit of dining at the near end of the long table, which reduced the geography of the thing to something approaching conversation. James asked, with the deliberate care of a man unsure of the terrain, what she had been reading in the library. Cecily looked up from her plate. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise exactly, but the slight readjustment of someone who had not expected to be asked. She told him. She was working through a collection of correspondence between 2 natural philosophers. She named them, neither of whom I have heard of since, and I suspect they were not prominent, and comparing their methods against a more recent treatise on the classification of species. She had an opinion about the treatise. She offered it briefly, watching him, clearly deciding whether he wanted the whole of it or merely the surface. James said, "Go on." She went on. For 20 minutes, she talked about the relationship between observation and conclusion, about the way certainty is too often mistaken for knowledge, about what she found both admirable and infuriating in the 2 old philosophers who could not agree on method, but kept writing to each other for 30 years regardless. James asked 2 questions. Both of them, I would discover when he recounted this to me later, were genuine ones, the kind of question a person asks because they want to know the answer. When she finished, there was a pause. Then Cecily said very simply, "You're interested." "Yes," James said. She looked at him again with that cataloging quality, the gray eyes moving over his face the way they moved over a room, reading it, deciding what was worth keeping. Then she said, "There is another text I found in your library that bears on the question. I could mark the relevant passage." "I would appreciate that," James said. She left a slim octavo volume on his desk the following morning, with a single folded note inside marking the page. He read it that evening. He left his own note in the book, a comment on the passage, brief and precise. She found it when she came to retrieve the volume. She read the note, and she smiled, and the footman who was polishing the hall floor later told Mrs. Alderton that the Duchess had looked as though she had found something she had not expected to find, and was very glad of it. I heard all of this from Mrs. Alderton over a period of weeks, in the way that one hears things in a large house, in fragments over tea, through the small reports of a woman who had loved Hartwell Hall for 3 decades and had been quietly waiting for it to come alive again. They were circling each other. That is the only way I can describe it. Not warily, or not only warily, but the way 2 careful people circle something they have each decided is worth approaching, not wanting to startle it. The library visits acquired a small ritual. She would leave a book on his desk when she found something that she thought would interest him, and he would leave a note in the book, and the notes became longer, more particular, until they were less notes and more the continuation of a conversation that had started over the natural philosophers and had not quite ended. He asked her, at dinner one evening in December, what she had thought of Hartwell when she first saw it. She said, "I thought it had been alone for a long time." He was quiet. Then he said, my first wife, found it cold." He had not spoken of a leaner to me in 4 years. I know because I counted. Cecily was still for a moment, and then she said, gently, "What was she like?" It was the question a person who is afraid of the answer does not ask. It was also the question a person who is genuinely interested in the man, in what had shaped him, asks without hesitation. James told her. Not everything, not in that first telling. James does not open all at once. He opens the way a house opens in spring, window by window, but something. He told her that Alina had been lovely and had hated the North and had died in the 3rd year of their marriage, before the heir she had hoped to give him had survived, and that he had understood afterward that he had not known her as well as a man should know his wife, and he did not know whose fault that was. Cecily said, after a moment, "I think grief is sometimes the thing we carry for the love we could not fully give. Not the love we failed to feel, but the expression of it, the moment we meant to say it and didn't, and then couldn't." James looked at her across the table. The candlelight was soft and the room was warm, which was still something of a small miracle at Hartwell, and she was looking at him with that directness that was not boldness and not softness, but something between them, an uncomplicated sincerity, the absence of performance. He said very quietly, "Yes. I think that was the night it shifted, though the shift was not visible yet, not to either of them, or not fully. These things move underground for a time, and you only know where the river is by the way the surface above it stays green in drought." Christmas came. The house filled briefly and incompletely, because James was not a man who opened Hartwell to large parties, with a few neighbors, myself, my wife Catherine, a cousin of James's who drank rather too much and was pleasant enough about it. Cecily moved through the house, as she always did, composedly and completely, overseeing the arrangements with Mrs. Alderton, making certain that the cold wing was kept closed, and the warm rooms were truly warm, spending an hour on Christmas morning with the kitchen staff in the manner of a duchess who has decided that the people who feed a household are worth knowing. I watched James watch her. He was not obvious about it. James is never obvious. But I had known him since we were boys at school, and I had learned to read the small frequencies, the tilt of his attention, the stillness that is not repose but focus, the way his face does the thing it does when he is deciding something, which is to go entirely quiet, like a very still body of water. He was deciding something about Cecily. He was, I suspected, in the process of learning that he had been wrong about what he wanted, and wrong about what was possible, and wrong, most profoundly wrong, about the nature of the arrangement he had made with such cold arithmetic at that desk in London. He had wanted a practical solution, a mistress for the hall, an orderly house, the prospect of an heir, the outward architecture of a life, because he had buried the inward version with a leaner and had not thought it available anymore. Cecily had given him all of it, but she had given him something else as well without being asked. She had given him the experience of being known, of having a person in the house who read his silences correctly, who asked the questions that had answers he cared about, who did not manage him or flatter him or require him to perform the role of a great duke in his own home, and who challenged, quietly and without ceasing, every tendency he had to retreat behind his cold competence. She did this simply by being herself, by refusing, as she had said she would refuse, to be invisible. By February, the notes in the library books had become full letters. Not love letters, nothing so declared, but letters of the kind that two people write when they have been talking for months and have run out of things that can be said briefly. He had begun to come to the library on Tuesday mornings, ostensibly to retrieve something from the shelves, actually to sit in the chair by the window and read while she worked. She did not remark on it. Neither did he. They sat in the same room in the same silence, not the silence of two strangers, but of two people who have found each other's company, improbably sufficient. It was in March that the terms of the marriage settlement came up. Not between them, not at first. It was Holt, the solicitor, who raised it in a letter to James, noting that the arrangement as originally drawn had no defined duration, that the question of issue remained unresolved, and that it might be advisable to revisit the terms now that the marriage was established. James brought the letter to me. "She came into this as a practical arrangement," he said. He was standing at the window of the smoking room, not looking at me. "She agreed to it on those terms. She kept her part of it entirely." "She has," I said carefully. "I don't know," he stopped. He set the letter on the mantelpiece. "I don't know what she wants now." I looked at him for a moment. "James, do you know what you want?" He was very still. "Yes," he said. It cost him something to say it. James does not often acknowledge desire, not in the sense of wanting something he does not already have, something that might be refused. He was a man who had learned to want only what could be obtained by will and management, because wanting what could not be managed was the kind of wound that did not close. "Then perhaps," I said gently, "you ought to tell her." He did not tell her that evening or the next. He told her on a Thursday morning in late March, in the library, in what I imagine was the most James Ashford way possible. He came into the room. She looked up from her work. He sat down in the chair by the window, which was by now simply his chair, and he set his hands on his knees and looked at her with that quality of decision that makes him formidable in every other context of his life. "I wish to revisit the terms of our arrangement," he said. Her pen stopped moving. She looked at him steadily. "In what regard?" "I agreed to a practical arrangement," he said. "I presented it as such. I treated it as such." He paused. He was not a man who searched for words as a rule. He was searching for them now, and he was not comfortable with the searching, and he was doing it anyway. "I have come to believe that the terms I proposed were—" He stopped. He looked at her, and something in his face that was usually held very still had given way slightly, the way stone gives way when the frost gets into it. "I made you a proposal that was designed to require nothing of me, nothing I was not certain I could provide. And what you have given me, what you are, is outside that accounting entirely, and I do not know how to." He stopped again. His jaw was tight. Cecily set down her pen. She was looking at him with the directness she always had, but there was something else in it now, a stillness, a held breath, the expression of someone hearing a sound they have hoped for and are afraid to believe. "James," she said, very quietly. He looked at her. "Are you telling me," she said, "that you wish you had asked differently?" A pause. A long one. Outside, the rooks in the elm trees were making their March noise, and the light through the library windows was the particular pale gold of an early spring morning that has not quite committed to warmth yet. "Yes," he said, "I am telling you that I wish I had asked you properly." She did not look away. "Then ask me now," she said. He asked her now. He stood up from the chair and he crossed the room and he stood before her desk and he did not take her hand. He looked at it, lying on the foolscap, and he looked at her face and he said, "I should have asked you because I wanted you, not because it was arithmetically tidy. I should have told you before we stood in that church that I had sat across that desk from you and watched you sign your name with steady hands and thought." He stopped. He gathered himself. "I should have told you that the house has not been cold since you came, that I have not been cold since you came, and that I would very much like to spend the rest of my life arguing about natural philosophers with you if you will let me." Cecily looked at him for a moment that was probably quite brief and felt, "I'm told," rather long. Then she said, "I will require it in writing. I am, as you know, particular about terms." The sound he made, it was not quite a laugh. James does not precisely laugh, but it was near enough that I counted it, was reportedly the first one Mrs. Alderton had heard in that library in years. Cecily stood up. She was nearly as tall as his shoulder, and she looked at him without flinching, the way she looked at everything, directly, carefully, without pretense. "I have also been wanting to tell you something," she said. "Since approximately December, I have been composing it for some time, and I cannot get the phrasing right, so I will simply say it plainly." She took a breath. "I came here because I had no other option, and I intended to make the best of it, and I was quite resolved to feel nothing for you that was not practical and sensible. And then you left notes in library books and asked questions that had real answers, and told me about a leaner with your hands on the table, and I find that I have entirely failed to feel nothing." James looked at her. His expression was the one I have only seen on his face a handful of times in 20 years of friendship. The expression of a man who has received something he was not prepared to receive, and is not certain how to hold it, and is trying very hard not to drop it. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, carefully, the way you take something that matters. "Then we are in agreement," he said. "We are," she said, "though I reserve the right to argue about the terms." "You always have," he said. She smiled at him, and that, I think, was that. They remained in the library for the better part of the morning. I know because I was having breakfast with Mrs. Alderton and the cook, having been told that the household was somewhat occupied, and we drank a great deal of tea, and no one made any particular comment. I will tell you what I saw in the months that followed, because I was at Hartwell often enough to see it. I saw a man who had spent a decade running a great estate at arm's length from any feeling that was not useful learn to come home. I do not mean in the geographic sense. James had always been at Hartwell. I mean in the way that a person comes home to himself when he has been wandering at a long remove and has finally found the right road. I saw him laugh properly in company. I saw him ask questions at dinner that had nothing to do with the management of land or finances. I saw him defer to her judgment on the North Wing repairs, not because it was expedient, but because he trusted her, which is a thing James Ashford does not do lightly or often, and which he was, by then, doing entirely. And I saw Cecily Ashford, inhabit that great house the way a woman inhabits a house when it is truly hers, not by possession but by belonging. The library on Tuesday mornings, yes, but also the long walks east along the lake at dusk, the evenings by the fire in the small sitting room, the particular confidence of a woman who has been met, fully and without reservation, by the person she has chosen to be met by. By summer, the North Wing servants were warm. The stair had its new rail. The library had 3 new shelves of natural philosophy texts acquired at some expense from a bookseller in York, on the Duchess's instructions, and annotated in 2 different hands. I dined with them in August, the 3 of us, and then Catherine joined us later in the evening, and we sat in the garden until the light went. And James refilled his glass, and Cecily said something about the classification question she had been worrying at since spring. And James said something back that was, I will not pretend otherwise, rather sharp and precise and correct, and she looked at him with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and pure delight. "You are occasionally," she informed him, "infuriatingly right." "I have been told," he said. "By whom?" "By you," he said, "approximately twice a week." She laughed. It was a whole laugh, unheld, the laugh of a woman who is entirely at ease in the place she is and the company she is in. James watched her laugh with the expression of a man who is still, on some level, astonished by his own good fortune. Not in the material sense, in the other sense, the one that cannot be arranged by a solicitor or settled by a deed of marriage. Catherine leaned to me and said very quietly, "I like her." "Yes," I said, "he does too." "I know," she said. "Isn't it extraordinary?" I have thought about that word since. Extraordinary. It seems an odd word for 2 people sitting in a garden on a summer evening, talking too much and laughing about natural philosophy. It is not the stuff of ballads. No one was humiliated publicly and then swept off their feet before a gasping crowd. No vows were spoken twice at a dramatic altar. No one was rescued from a blizzard. What happened was this. A woman was placed in a house and refused to be invisible in it, and a man noticed, and then could not stop noticing, and somewhere between the first library book and the last, the architecture he had built to keep the world at a manageable distance was quietly, thoroughly replaced. She had come to Hartwell to settle a debt. He had thought that was what she was for. He told me once, near the end of that first year, that the thing he regretted most about the beginning was not that he had made a practical arrangement instead of a genuine proposal, though he regretted that, but that he had walked into that study in London and looked at Cecily Vane across a desk and thought, in his efficient way, that he understood what she was. A solution, a transaction, a set of terms, and she had signed her name with steady hands and looked at him with those gray eyes and said, "I will not be made to feel invisible in my own home." And he had thought, agreed. He had not known then what he was agreeing to. He had not known that she would find the cold wing and the crooked stare and the solicitor's letter on the mantelpiece and the thing in him that had been cold for longer than the North Wing. He had not known that she would find all of it, methodically and without ceremony, and set about making it right. He knows now, he has known for some time. I asked him once, a few years ago now, whether he thought it was strange, the beginning of it, the arithmetic of it, the way it might have been. He was quiet for a moment. Outside his window, the lake was the same pewter gray it always is in winter, and the elms were bare, and the house was warm. "I think," he said, "that I had the extraordinary luck of having my equal walk into a room and tell me plainly what she required, and the further luck of being, for once in my life, wise enough to agree." He looked out at the lake for a moment. "Though I wish," he said, "that I had had the sense to ask her properly first." I did not tell him that wishing was a new habit for him. I merely agreed. It was, in the end, the most expensive arithmetic he ever did, and the only sum he has never once regretted.